Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be here with the Conscious Codependent Coach, Cheryl Fidelman. Welcome back.
Hi, thanks. I'm psyched to be here.
It's great to have you here. And for those of you who perhaps didn't see Cheryl in the first series, Cheryl has been my coach for many years now. And so I love that we can do this together and talk about codependence and grief. And particularly today, we're going to talk about conscious codependent anger and how that relates to our experience of grief, because a lot of people experience anger, and a few people have come to me specifically talking about family members that have reacted in, everybody reacts in their own way, but some of them have almost become estranged from each other because of the anger. So Cheryl, maybe to begin with, I know that you recently did a whole summit on codependent anger.
I did, yeah.
And that's what made me think you would be the perfect person to talk about this emotion. So perhaps you could begin with talking about conscious codependent anger and what that means.
Yeah, so thanks. I'll start by defining what I mean by codependence when it comes to the point of view of my particular work. So the definition that I like to use for codependence is my experience depends on you. So if I'm happy, it's your fault. If I'm sad, it's your fault. If I'm angry, it's your fault. If I don't feel safe, it's your fault. So a lot of us who either identify as codependent, or some people just have some codependent habits that they want to work on. They don't necessarily identify as a full-blown codependent. When we have a feeling or emotion, we go outside of ourselves for the source of it. So anything I feel or experience, I'm going to somebody else. They made me feel this way. They did this to me. So when it comes to what I call codependent anger, which would be, there's plenty of healthy anger. I think that anger can be healthy. I think that it's a valid emotion, but a lot of us don't have a great relationship with anger because we either weren't demonstrated healthy anger when we were children, or we were punished for our own anger when we were children. So we're either scared of other people's emotions, or we're scared of our own emotions, or we think that we're going to get punished if we take up too much space with our emotions. So for a lot of us codependents, we just have a very unhealthy relationship with anger. So when I say codependent anger, it's another emotion that we go outside of ourselves. So in other words, you're making me angry, or they did this to me. Instead of taking responsibility and looking at how my interpretation of what is happening could be causing me anger. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to grief, I don't know if we're talking about death or breakups, or I guess if you're talking about family members, maybe you're talking about death.
Yeah, and that's, relating to death.
So I think that one of the foundational causes of anger is powerlessness. Mm. And we're powerless over what somebody else is doing, or we're powerless over what happened. And often with death, we often feel powerless. There's nothing we could do about it. And so the anger is this sometimes it's a reaction to a loss of control. I cannot control this. There's nothing I can do about it. Or we think this family member should have done something about it. So it's often hard for us to admit to somebody else's powerlessness. I couldn't do anything. They should have done something. Also, when it comes to this like break in relationship with family, the other thing that I want to bring up is, I made a note about this, is from the point of view of my work, codependence lacks curiosity. When we're in a codependent moment, we're not curious. We're pretty much righteous about what somebody else is doing and our interpretation of it. And so codependent anger would be not being curious about what is actually happening for other people. And when there's a death in the family, the context of the family completely changes. All of a sudden, we're all living without a mom. We never had that experience before. We're living without a grandmother, or whatever your position is in the family is, or we don't have that paternal element anymore, the grandfather or the father or the stepfather. And so the whole configuration changes. Now we have to have conversations about lawyers and money. We never talked about lawyers and money together before, right? So first of all, there's a shock to the system of the family. Everybody has to have conversations they've never had before. Some people don't know anything about. All of a sudden they're talking to lawyers, like, I never talked to lawyers about probate before in my life. Like, what is that even, or what's a trust, So people are dealing newly with things they've never dealt before, adding on the shock of losing that person. Then everybody gets angry at each other. Well, because they're not being curious. They're not going, what's this like for you? What are you going through? What's your interpretation of what's happening? Maybe we shouldn't talk about this for 6 months. Let's heal a little bit. Let's let go of this. And so a lot of this powerlessness, we hold on because we want to have power where we don't have it. And then we blame others for our experience. And that's where the codependence comes in, when we blame others for our experience. So I know I just said a lot, so I'll pause there.
No,
I don't know if you have any. Yeah.
Well, I think everything you're saying is super powerful about the powerlessness, and that is a big part of it, because we feel as if we can control life a lot of the time, or we have a perception of how our lives should be and how it should turn out. And death comes along. It's always a shock, really. And I love what you're saying about this lacking curiosity. Those few lines that you said were so helpful about, like, how is this for you? What's going on for you? Maybe we just have to give each other space for 6 months, because anytime we speak, there's too much tension and the anger rises. But really being able to communicate that, as opposed to shutting down, because I think that's often what happens. Like, people either sort of go into they can't cope with it and they shut down, or they just get into arguments all the time.
Yeah, and when people are in arguments, especially when there is some sort of a death or loss or illness, from the point of view of my work, one of the things that I train people to do is notice your emotional state, do your best to notice another person's emotional state. Because when we're not aware of our emotional state, we're definitely not aware of somebody else's emotional state. And then we're not even there and we're arguing. Like we're not present, we're not there. We're just arguing because we're holding on to being right, or we're holding on to proving. And I want to bring in my 3 tenets of conscious codependence. And if any of the viewers want to take notes, I'm also going to give you access to my free PDF of my 3 tenets as well. So my 3 tenets of conscious codependence are the want to be wanted, the need to be needed, or the need to prove oneself. So anytime we're locked into any one of these 3 tenets, we're in a codependent moment. And when we talk about anger and arguing, people are often either in the 3rd tenet, which is proving their point of view, proving I'm a victim to what you're doing, proving that you're not seeing it right, right? So there's a whole bunch of proving my point of view, proving that I'm a victim, proving that you screwed up. a lot of that is not me saying, this is how I feel. This is what I think I might have done wrong. This is what I'm projecting or interpreting about you. Am I accurate? Right? So we don't have our feet on the ground. We're just in the other person's head proving. And that's another piece of my work is I train people to just get out of other people's space. Get out of their mind, get out of what you think they're thinking, what you think they're saying, what you think they're doing to you. Like, just, so, and the other oftentimes piece of arguing is oftentimes why people don't just go, let's just take a break. This isn't working. We're both like all over the place because we want to sustain the want to be wanted. If I leave this conversation, maybe you're going to be mad at me. You're not going to want me. Or if I leave this conversation, you're going to misinterpret me and then judge me and hate me. This is for a lot of us codependents, is we stay in conversations and get hooked into conversations because we don't know how to put up a boundary with an open heart. Which is, I love you and I just got to go right now. And I'll be back, or I won't be back, or whatever is the truth. And then whatever happens for the other person, they spin around, chase their tail like a dog, or they get more angry, or they go, okay, whatever their response is, that we actually keep our boundary and an open heart and allow them to have their reaction. But it's hard for us codependents to do that. So we'll just stay in the conversation and we'll, oh my gosh, 6 hours and I'm still texting this person. I didn't even get my work done for the last 6 hours, or I didn't sleep last night because I was arguing with this person all night. Nothing changed, nothing happened, but I couldn't unhook from it.
Right. Yeah. So talk about the unhooking a little bit more, like how people can, I think for me personally, I didn't grow up with much anger around me. Generally, there were times when it would come up, but I'm very sort of afraid of anger. And for some reason, like, how is that's going to affect me? And I don't want people to be angry with me. And how do I respond to an angry person? Well, personally, my way is to usually, just distance myself, as opposed to, as you were saying, putting up a healthy boundary. So I just wondered, I know you've alluded to it a little bit about the putting the boundary in place and keeping an open heart. If you could give another example of that to somebody, say with a family, somebody's sister, for example, who they were really close to, their dad died, and the sister is just they're not interacting how they used to. There's tension and there's not the same closeness. What sort of advice would you give somebody like that about putting up a boundary, something that they could say?
Well, it's hard for me to address like a hypothetical thing because there's so many layers, in situations. But when it comes to not wanting people to be angry at us, so this is another like angle of looking at anger. So there's our own anger, whether we express it or we don't express it, or we repress it and act like everything's okay, but it really isn't okay. But then there's, how do we welcome or avoid or interact with somebody else's anger? So somebody is really angry at you because of this case where the father died and the two sisters, or whatever the situation is. We will, for those of us who are codependents, we will often exhaust ourselves to please another person just so they won't be angry at us. We just can't handle people being angry at us. We either completely set aside our own preferences or wants and desires just to appease somebody else and calm them down so that we get back in their good graces because we have the want to be wanted. If you're mad at me, it means you don't want me. And I want you to want me. So whatever, I don't care. But don't worry about what bothers me. Let's just talk about what bothers you, right? Because I want you to come back into connection with me. Also, sometimes somebody else gets angry at us and we get angry at them just because they're angry at us. And this happens a lot in family dynamics. I mean, it happens with friends and coworkers too, but most of this is heightened in the family dynamic. So, your sister or your brother is mad at you and you go, well, F you, I'm mad at you too, just because you're mad at me for that, right? And so our anger gets triggered just because they're angry. So sometimes we'll mirror it. And we might not be angry about the incident that they're talking about, but we'll go, all right, you're angry at me at this. Let me bring up my whole list of things from 1994 and 2002 and 2008, Christmas, summer, fall, right? And so I talk also a lot about the codependent list in my work. That's one of my distinctions, where we have lists on people. And that list can be triggered, in many different ways, especially when somebody else is mad at us or thinks we're the perpetrator or thinks we did something wrong and we don't think we did that thing wrong. So these are all examples of where curiosity is thrown out the window, especially when someone's mad at us and, instead of going, what a liar, or F you, or like, I'm mad at you too because of all these other things that you did. One of the things that I train people to do is stay in their body, feel the sensation of what feels like a threat, stay in your body, lean into curiosity. What do you mean by that? What's bothering you? What do you remember about that? What was your interpretation about that? And so we stay in our world because codependence is an act of disassociating from ourselves and then serving somebody else's reality. And so I train people to stay in their world, stay in your body, notice your sensations, your emotions, your thoughts, and then practice curiosity at the same time.
I love that. Yeah, I really do love that. And going back to, how we express our anger. So again, that can be difficult for many of us, that we just want to repress it and think that everything's okay, that we think that being angry is bad. For example, at the beginning of this conversation, you said, I think that there really is a time and a place for anger and it's a valid emotion. So do you have any thoughts about ways of expressing anger?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I just want to write that question down because I wanted to get back to just one other thing, which is this staying in our body, in the visceral expression of our body, and then leaning into curiosity. I want to highlight that I'm not saying that practice with an undertone of it's easy, just try what I'm saying, right? Because it's not easy. It's a practice. And I train people over time to practice this, and especially when there's grief, because there is an added multiple dimensions of layers of shock with yourself and your family members or your friends. So this is an even more important time. And to answer your question, ways of expressing, it's an even more important time actually for us not to talk. And sometimes the best way of expressing anger is actually not talking. That doesn't mean not expressing. It means not talking and actually feeling it in relationship with yourself. We don't always have to unload it on somebody else. And we can unload it or show it or demonstrate it in front of somebody else. It's best either when you know the practice of expressing anger without blaming somebody else for how you're feeling. I'm angry. I'm interpreting a threat here. I think I think that this is how I interpreted what you said, and I'm feeling I'm feeling betrayed, right? So I'm feeling, as opposed to you did this, you did that. That's where anger creates separation, like massive separation. And it's one of the reasons why anger is one of the most complicated emotion for for humans to experience or handle or communicate, because it creates such separation, or it can create such separation when we're blaming somebody else for our anger. Was there some part of that I didn't answer yet? Did I get to it?
I think I was thinking, maybe a little bit more about how we can express. You said, not necessarily through talking. Sometimes it's just like by, tapping into it, into our bodies, and any other sort of physical ways of expressing it.
Well, I'll talk about my TSE practice. So I have what I call my conscious codependence TSE practice. So that's thought, sensation, emotion. And this is a somatic experiencing practice where we stay with ourselves and we notice what's a thought right now, what's a sensation, and what's an emotion. Because oftentimes when we're triggered, we have this ball of a reaction. We have thoughts, sensations, emotions. We believe our thoughts. We believe that we're being threatened, when oftentimes when we're triggered, depending on what kind of trauma you had when you were a child, your nervous system can't tell if what's happening is a real threat or a perceived threat. So that's why it's often best to sit with ourselves. How am I interpreting this? What are the sensations in my body? What are the emotions? What's going on with me? And when we don't have a solid relationship with ourselves, which is true for a lot of us codependents. I mean, a lot of us codependents, especially early on in our recovery, we have either a broken relationship with ourselves, or we don't even have a self. I mean, that was me, 15, probably up until about 15 years ago. Like, I didn't even have a self, so I had to build one. And that's one thing that I do in my work. Like in the healing world, there's all this talk about self-care and self-awareness. Well, for some of us, we go, well, that's a really nice idea if you have a self. But so anyway, it's, not that every codependent doesn't have a self, but some of us are pretty in that kind of red zone with our codependence. So thought, sensation, emotion, I highly recommend, either if people work with me or they find some other healer, that if something like this, if anger is a real issue for you, then lean into a somatic experiencing path. Because this is what's going to heal the trauma in your cell memory. This is what's going to have you stay in the emotions and sensations of your body, instead of it being so overwhelming that we have to jump out and yell at somebody. That's often what happens, is we just have to jump out of ourselves. It's too intense. But with my kind of work, or some other somatic healers' work, there is nothing too intense for us to feel within our body. We expand the threshold of the emotions and sensations. And we develop a relationship with ourselves where we go, all right, Cheryl, what's going on? What are we thinking? What are we interpreting? What's happening here?
Yeah, and I think reminding people, as you did, that it's not something that's straightforward to begin with, because we're so, the moments between our reaction and like just jumping into the anger and the upset, we don't always get the time to center myself, what's going on, that takes practice, like you said. So I just wanted
it takes practice, and it takes a noticing. The more we practice it, the more we can notice I just went outside myself. Let me take it back, come back, let me come back here. That our return time to ourselves is a little bit shorter. Like, oh, I just left myself for 3 days. Oh, this time I only left myself for 1 day. This time came back in 12 minutes. That was great. Freaked out a little bit on this person. I was the victim. They did this to me. I'm back now, noticing my sensations and emotions. And the more we practice staying with ourselves, which is one of the highlights and intentions of my work, the more we stay in relationship with ourselves, the more life becomes like a moving meditation. The more we feel, the more we sense, the more we imagine, because our codependent interpretations, our angry interpretations, and our projections suck our inner wisdom. They suck our imagination. We just get singularly focused, going over these conversations with people in our minds, replaying them. So it really sucks how broad our minds can be.
What keeps coming up for me while we're talking is the sentence, we're never upset for the reasons we think we are, which is from A Course in Miracles. And I often think about that, because it's always like, well, what's beneath the anger at the end of the day? And a lot of the time it is the sadness, and it is the grief, and it's we don't know what, everyone's going to have their emotions come up in different orders and different ways, but I do think personally that's often, anger is often masking some, maybe a more vulnerable emotion that some people don't want to express, or have people see them in a vulnerable place. Maybe anger feels more comfortable for them as opposed to sadness more, and that's one of their ways of expressing it. So perhaps that's an act of curiosity as well. So when somebody else is really angry, we can stay in our curiosity that, like, maybe that's because they just can't access something else right now.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's a great way of saying, like, what the act of curiosity can bring us to. It can bring us to somebody else's heart. It can bring us to our own hearts. Yeah. And often anger is somebody disassociated from themselves, not connecting with their heart. And when we can't be with anger, a lot of us can't be with anger because to us, anger isn't safe. And so the more I heal my traumas around anger, my mom was a rageaholic. She was always beyond screaming, ripping apart the house and in and out of mental hospitals. And so anger for me was like life or death. And it was always like, is she going to blow up the house, or is she just calling me for dinner? Like, I couldn't even tell in the tone of her voice, like, if we were safe. So the more I've been able to heal my relationship to anger, the more I don't run when somebody's angry, the more I can stay in relationship with myself and lean into curiosity and get deeper into what's happening for the other person. But when one or more of us disassociates from ourselves, then there is no heart. Nobody's connected to their heart.
Yeah, and then we get the separation and the breakdown. And that's what happens in many families after a big death, and maybe that's also something to say to people that, unfortunately, that can be a very normal situation. And even thinking of my sisters and I, honestly, we're much closer now than we probably ever have been. And I think there was times where, seeing each other's pain, or just wanting to go off and do life on our own terms, that there wasn't like much anger between us, but the idea of the separation definitely resonates for me, that it was like, not wanting to get really vulnerable at some moments, just to almost not trigger one another's sadness, because their pain is going to trigger my pain, and how are we all going to cope? So it's better, we would actually use a lot of humor in a way to mask our sadness, I think.
Yeah, and for those of you who sign up for the free 3 Tenets of Codependence, Conscious Codependence PDF, you'll be on my email list, and you'll get my Fridays with Fidelman videos, and I send out for free. And I did a Fridays with Fidelman, like, I think it was last year or the year before, and it was called the Dead Parents Society. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to put that video out. My dad died almost 20 years ago. It still seems like it was like last week. And, you know, when somebody loses a parent, for a lot of us, it's like life before their death and life after. I mean, it's often just 2 different lives. You're 2 different people. All of a sudden, a side of you that just never existed before, that you couldn't even fathom before they died. Like, before my dad died, I just didn't have the portal in my brain of having a dead parent. I just didn't have that framing of life. So that's another thing that happens in families is, it would be great, maybe in some hospices they do this, because I remember they were giving us pamphlets in the hospice, but it would be great to give people some sort of a pamphlet or training to say, listen, your life is never going to be the same now. And your system on many levels is going to be in shock for a year or 2 years or 5 years. Just leave each other alone for a little bit, or just accept the weird things that are happening, because you're now you're now being shocked into a different phase of life, and everybody's orienting in their own way.
Yeah, quite right. There's one other area that I just wanted to cover as well, about when we're not necessarily angry with another person, but we're sort of angry with the world, or that we're living in, the injustices that happen, or we're angry at God. And that people may not may not know what to sort of do with that anger, because again, that causes all the separation that we see so much at the moment, that we have, you know, a lot of separation happening in our world. And I was just thinking, is there anything else that you would offer in those circumstances? I guess it would also come back to, again, keeping an open heart about things.
Well, you know, I can't help but to think of the recent shootings, just like what's in the world right now, when you talk about being angry at the world. And I don't, you know, it's not like I have some huge enlightened answer about that. But what I do know is, when there's a powerlessness, and this is, for a lot of us, it's a massive powerlessness. Like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? There's nothing I can do about it. And people are ripped and torn apart because of it. Are we powerless to the lawmakers? I'm not a political person, but this is just the kind of powerlessness that I'm hearing. I think that the best thing that we can do is to say what we want. I'm not saying we're going to get what we want, but stay in your body, stay with your emotions, notice the emotions, and say what you want and how you're feeling. Because when we say, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, it just provides distance, even more distance than there already is in the rights and belief systems around gun laws and in other areas in life in general. Whenever you say, you did this to me, you're not going to get what you want 9 times out of 10. There is no request in there. It's a blame. It's a shame. It's a pushing away. There's no request.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Cheryl. I know that it's a big kind of question, but I also, yeah, go ahead.
No, it's a big question, and you know, I've witnessed people be mad at me, and then when they cool off, they go, "Well, I just wanted XYZ," or I've witnessed couples, because I do a lot of couples coaching. Well, I just wanted XYZ. Well, I did not hear that at all in the last 10 minutes you were yelling at me. How would I have heard what you wanted? Now I hear it, but I didn't hear it then because it wasn't expressed as a want. It was expressed as a blame. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that piece.
Yeah, thank you. We're coming to the end of our time. I know that I've asked you this question before, but if you would be willing, again, with your own interpretation, because I've been finishing each interview with, you know, what your interpretation of conscious grief would be.
Well, when I think of being conscious, I think of awareness of what we're feeling, awareness of our reaction, awareness of our interpretation. When I think of conscious grief, it has to me kind of like a, I don't know if a spiritual element is the right way to put it, but it has an acknowledgement that I'm in an acknowledgement of I'm in a grief, I'm in a process. It's an acknowledgement of the process that you're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sometimes it takes a coach like yourself, or it takes just going through grief and looking back and go, I didn't even realize I was grieving for the last 5 years, right? Or it takes a coach to say, oh, you're grieving. You might be grieving 30 years later that your dad left 30 years ago because it's coming up, it's being triggered in different relationships. So it's an awareness and an acknowledgement of being inside of a process.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And just before we finish, I know that you'd mentioned that you have got your three tenants that you're going to give away, and also you're going to do complimentary 30-minute calls with anybody that would like to speak to you about their codependency. Yeah.
So if you go to CherylFidelman.com, and it'll be in the email of this interview, CherylFidelman.com, you put your email address in and you'll get the free PDF. It's a worksheet and breakdown of each tenant, the root behavior, the root cause. There's specific questions so that you can customize the tenants to see if they fit in and if you relate to them and if they can be of service to you in some areas of your life. And then once you get the PDF, it'll give you an option to schedule a free 45-minute conscious codependence consultation with me. And we will really, in that session, get to the root of some of your codependent behaviors. And I fundamentally am an early childhood trauma healer, but I focus on codependence as one of the most obvious ways we demonstrate our unhealed trauma. So we'll get to the root of your patterns, your story, your codependent narrative, what's been playing through in your life over and over. But yeah, whether or not you book a session, you'll still get your PDF, and then you'll be in the conscious codependence community and get your videos, and we have free classes and all that stuff.
Amazing. And I can highly recommend taking Cheryl up on that as my amazing coach for so many years. So
yeah, it's been now maybe 8-9 years or something.
I think it's been a lot longer than that, you know.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's
wow.
Yeah, 10.
I think we've been saying 8 years for like 3 years.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We have double digits for sure. And any other last things that you wanted to share just before we wrap up?
I just want to highlight that should you resonate with being a codependent or having codependent behaviors, I always want to make sure that I tell people codependence is not you. It's not you. It's your traumatic identity. It's the part of yourself that is programmed, the identity that was created to survive your parents' or your guardian's reality. So codependence is not you. So in my work, we have your true nature and your true self, and then we have that codependent side that hooks into other people, that codependent side that has an inner punisher. So that codependent side that looks to other people for our safety, but that's not you. Your true self is safe and self-expressed and innocent and pure and can exchange intimate, authentic moments. So we really peel apart the habits of your traumatic identity and the habits of your true self. So it's good news that your codependence is not you.
Oh, Cheryl, thank you so much. I've loved talking to you about this subject.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you, everybody who's been watching.